Welcome back, guys. I'm Dr. Jason Won, orthopedic physical therapist, and today I wanted to talk about returning to running 101. So if you are somebody that is interested in running, or if you're somebody that was a previous runner and wants to return to running, but maybe you're uncertain of how to get there, you're maybe fearful of maybe injuring yourself. So maybe you're of later age, like 30 plus. I want to share with you a lot of different strategies and principles that you can use in order to return to running safely. Now, why should you listen to me? Because I've been 8 years as a certified running trainer from therunningclinic.com. I'll leave the description of therunningclinic.com because there's a number of different resources like returning to running training plans that are absolutely free on a PDF. There's a running shoe database, there's a minimalist index, and there's a lot of research-based articles and even beginners strength training that you can utilize from the website. Go to therunningclinic.com and you can access a number of resources there. And so I want this to be probably the most detailed and comprehensive episode on how you can return to running safely. And I myself, at age 36, I'm still running, I'm still sprinting. I used to deal with a lot of other chronic knee issues stemming from either overtraining or wearing the wrong shoe wear. I've also had a number of different Achilles issues in the past. And so for me, considering that I do strength training, I still do a mixture of running, basketball. I want to share with you strategies that I use even to prevent running injuries from happening too. So where we'll start off first is this. We're going to start off with, first of all, going through why running is important for humans in general. The second thing we'll do is we'll teach you how you can return to running safely through a principle called mechanical stress quantification. We'll also look at what I look for when I'm working with somebody either online or in person and how I evaluate their running form. So I actually get them on a treadmill and film them. And actually, I'll tell you the step-by-step things that I look for. I'll also talk to you about proper shoe wear that is correct for you in terms of running, because not all running shoes are created equal. Clearly, there are different features and different benefits. There's also pros and cons to different types of shoe wear. So I'm going to go into that as well. I'm also going to go into what are the proper strength and mobility principles to ensure minimal to no setbacks when it comes to you returning to running. And the last thing I want to share right now is a free gift to you. So the free gift, I'm not going to wait till the end. I want to give it to you right away, but I actually have my own book on injury prevention for runners. So if you are somebody that is truly interested in a detailed ebook, a free PDF that you can utilize right now. I actually wrote an ebook months ago when I did a couple running workshops in San Francisco. So if you're interested in downloading that, go to, again, flexodrj.online/runners-ebook. I'll leave a description in the episode here, and you can download that absolutely free. Either share it with a friend that wants to return to running, if you're going to have an accountability buddy, or if you just want to utilize it for your own purposes. Okay. So with all that said, let's talk about why is running important for humans. So just to kind of break down walking and running, there is always two phases. There is a stance phase and there's also an air phase. So there's a phase where like one leg or both legs are up in the air. When we are walking, it's always going to be one leg down on the ground. However, when we're running, it's a mixture of single leg hopping. Okay, now single leg hopping is there's always going to be this phase where our body is completely suspended in the air. And there's also going to be a phase where there's always one foot on the ground. Okay. Now these two phases are going to switch a little bit, right? So when we are walking, our feet are not moving as fast. So it's usually going to be about 80% stance phase and about 20% on the air phase. However, it switches when it comes to running. Running, there's more of a 60 to 40 ratio where 60% of the time we are spent in the air and at 40% we're spent on a single leg. And this depends on your cadence, how fast you move, how strong you are, how fast you can get up off the floor. So those are going to be important principles that we talk about. But in terms of running, there is an air phase and a stance phase. Now, running is very important for humans because I perceive it like this. I'm going to talk to you about a relative, more just conscious way of thinking of it. When we're runners, if you can run and you have the capacity to run, you should run. And the reason why is because humans are born to run. And however, society nowadays is that most of us spend a lot of time working on our career and our finances. We're all very career driven and we all spend a lot of time at the computer now. So a lot of us start to lose the ability to run or even sprint at a much earlier age relative to previous decades. But if you have the ability to run, you want to be able to do so because running is a faster mode of transportation. And also, if you can always run, you'll always have the ability to walk, which seems like common sense. But if you can run in life, you'll never lose the ability to walk. So if I can run into my 90s, I can always walk in my 90s. Some people lose the ability to walk, into later ages too. So if you have the capacity and you have the strategies on how to continue to run into later ages, you should. Because if you can always improve and maintain a sense of velocity and speed, research does actually show that you decrease your risk for falls. I say this to a lot of my clients that are interested in running all the time, is that the average time it takes to walk across the street is 2.2 miles per hour. So if it's 2.2 miles per hour, that's the average time it takes to cross the street. Guess what happens when you start to walk slower than 2.2 miles per hour? Well, one, you might not be able to get from one block to the other safely, and it might be a red light by the time you get close to across the street. And also, if you do start to walk slower than 2.2 miles per hour, you increase your risk for falling by 400%, by fourfold. And that's a crazy statistic. So if you are increasing your risk of falling by fourfold, that means that your balance is not as good as it once was. And also, guess what happens in your later age when you do increase your risk for falls? You also increase your risk for fractures, namely hip fractures. And if you sustain a hip fracture, basically your life expectancy after a hip fracture is about 5 years, statistically. So why it's like there's a cascade of events as a result of not deciding to run, or let's say in your 30s and 40s, you're somebody that's in your 30s and 40s, maybe you gave up running because too stressful on the knees, too stressful on the hips, Achilles, etc. And I honestly think it's like, well, you kind of just toss it up as a loss. Nobody really taught you how to continue to run or work through it. And so you kind of just gave it up. But I encourage you to think that based on this episode, Running 101 or Injury Prevention 101, how to return to running, is that you hopefully will find some motivation and even the right strategies on how to return to running safely. Okay, so that's the really important reasons why. Also, running has been shown to improve your mitochondrial density, your VO2 max, your respiratory reserve, so it keeps your lungs healthy, your heart's healthy. Cardiovascular activity, when done 5 to 6 times a week for at least 30 to 60 minutes, you actually decrease all-cause mortality by about 30 to 35%. And this is statistics, so maybe about 20 to 35%. But from the research, if you increase your VO2 max, if you actually continue to run through life, you're not just going to improve your lower leg density. So that's another benefit, is actually maintaining proper bone density to the entire system as a whole, but specifically your legs. So that's really another important aspect of running. But also, like I said, you decrease your risk of dying of anything by about 20 to 35% by keeping your cardiovascular capacity up. And that's keeping your brain as well as your heart, as well as your lungs healthy. Okay, so hopefully I've highlighted a lot of the benefits of running and why you should consider running, because I see this all the time where people are like, what do you do for exercise? I walk. And I always say that walking, one, is not stimulating enough to build strength and to maintain muscle mass. That's one. But also walking is a very low intensity and not challenging the heart and lungs to the capacity that you need. So all in all, your heart, your cardiac output will decrease over time. Your lung capacity will decrease over time. Your respiratory reserve and the ability to breathe through any strenuous exercise will also decrease over time. So that's why I always find that I think amongst the many cardiovascular exercises out there, running to me is actually the most beneficial because of bone density increase, because of the demands on the heart and everything. And I do find, yes, there's elliptical, there's biking, and a lot of stuff. A lot of those are less stressful on the entire skeletal system. So I like things that stress my system so that my skeleton stays strong. And also I think about a lot of these other more modified versions of running, like elliptical. It's just not going to challenge the body as much. So I understand that if you have a lot of pain in your knees or your hips or your lower back, and the doctor said, stop doing more intense activities on the system like running, or you may be even told that running is bad for your knees, your lower back. I'd beg to differ. Right? This is a very old school way of thinking where doctors are trying to play it safe. They're trying to not stress the system at all. A lot of doctors, they don't know, how to rehab somebody properly. So they'll just play it safe. They'll give you something overly conservative, like, well, if your knees hurt with running, just stop running, just go to biking or go to elliptical or just walk. And it's unfortunate that a lot of our society succumbs to, I guess, expertise when these are not experts, right? These are just people that have general knowledge about musculoskeletal system, about exercise, fitness, cardiovascular activity, and weight training. So if that's part of what we're going to talk about is like, if you do weight train, you will build the muscular capacity in order to run. Okay. So hopefully I'm hitting on the right notes on like the indications for why you should run. Okay, so let's talk about now part 2, which is how you can return to running safely through something called mechanical stress quantification. Okay, so mechanical stress quantification, and maybe I'll link a graph or I'll link a YouTube video from therunningclinic.com. Mechanical stress quantification in a very lay term is basically stressing the body enough through running where it does have positive adaptations, but not stressing it so much that it leads to an injury. Okay, so if I were to pull up this graph here, there is a graph in which basically on the x-axis, the x-axis is like the amount of like steps. Okay, the amount of steps or even the distance or the time. So you're quantifying the amount of stress to the body. And then on the y-axis is basically the amount of force output or like the amount of stress on the skeletal system, right? So basically the longer you run, the more stress in the system. The faster you run, the more stress on the system, right? So those are all on the x-axis, which is that quantification. And then, so basically what we're thinking about is this window of adaptation, right? We call it like the ZOA. I call it like the zone of adaptation. So the zone of adaptation is anything under the line. There's 2 lines for the zone of adaptation. The top line is your capacity, right? So your capacity is the amount that any given structure in your body can tolerate. Okay, so like, for example, a battery on an average phone is 4,000 milliamps, right? So that's the battery capacity. And so if you're thinking about an injured area that you're trying to resolve and you want to return to running, so let's say it's your right knee has a specific capacity for load, and that would be the top line of your zone of adaptation. And so if you surpass that line, surpass that capacity, then that area might hurt or that area might become symptomatic. So for example, if you're going from no running at all and you decide to run a mile right now, well, how does your body respond after not running for years? You may flare something up, right? So you might surpass that top line, which is the capacity for your right knee, and the right knee might get inflamed. You might develop tendonitis. And so this is the most common thing. The thing that you should understand is that when it comes to like injuries, specifically with running, is it because of poor genetics? Is it because of your shoe wear? So this is the thing I want you to understand and write this down. 90% of all running injuries come from overtraining. Overtraining in the form of increasing speed too fast, increasing distance too fast. It's training too frequently when you weren't ready for it. It's the improper shoe wear. Maybe it's an acute change in shoe wear. It's basically any training variable that you change too quickly, too soon, can basically will enable the chances of you getting injured by surpassing that capacity line that we talked about. So like I said, zone of adaptation, we talked about that first top line, which is your capacity line. So if you run a mile and you're not ready for it, you increase the chances of injuring that knee or straining that knee or causing some sort of inflammatory response. Okay. Now the line below the capacity line, so there's always like a little distance between the lines. And again, that y-axis is the total amount of mechanical stress, right? That's what we call mechanical stress quantification, MSQ. Now that bottom line is the minimal dose response, okay, MDR. Okay, so the minimal dose response is basically saying that you need to run a certain amount or you need to increase some sort of variable a certain amount in order for you to either expand the zone of adaptation. So basically allowing you to have a wider range of variables that in which you can train properly in running. But the most important thing when it comes to getting that minimal dose response. So you need to, like, let's say just start with jogging for 1 minute really, really lightly, right? A lot of people at the age of 30 to 50 have the ability to jog maybe lightly for 1 minute, even if it's just like trotting, you're barely even getting off the floor, right? Sometimes I'll just start off with interval training, 1 minute run, 1 minute walk, 1 minute run, 1 minute walk. So that bottom line is the minimal dose response. And your job, especially when you're back on a running training plan or a return to running protocol, is you need to get between the minimal dose response and also that capacity line. So if you surpass the first bottom line, which is the minimal dose response, then what you're going to do with that capacity line is the capacity line is going to increase. And you want to increase that capacity line as much as humanly possible. So then you'll be able to tolerate longer distances, more speed, and again, increase the intensity, the volume, the amount of time that you can run, which is going to improve all the other cardiovascular benefits, bone density benefits that I talked about in the beginning. Okay. So that's your zone of adaptation. Okay. Which basically is your minimal dose response as well as your capacity line. Okay. So when it comes to returning to running, that is the zone that you want to hit, that zone of adaptation. Now, this is talking about principles of how to return to running. Now, how do we actually quantify that? Now, you can either download apps like Strava, Strava. You can also download Garmin if you have a Garmin watch. You can also simply just have some sort of like spreadsheet or even a piece of paper. The variables that I would think about are, again, you're talking about frequency. How often per week do you run? You're also talking about the distance or the time, right? So sometimes you don't take both variables because everybody runs at different speeds. So you would start off with definitely the frequency. So frequency for beginners or return to runners, usually I'm thinking sometimes around 2 to 3 days per week. And it depends on your capacity currently. So some people can tolerate 4 to 5 immediately, but to be safe and conservative, you'll start off with about 2 to 3 days a week of running. The second thing you want to think about is choosing distance or time. And this is variable depending on the client. So a lot of time, I'll usually go based on time because time is the easier thing. It's like you can actually set a watch on your phone and actually go for a run outdoors or indoors. So safe variables that I would always go for are either 30 to 60-second runs followed by 1 minute walk. And this is what we call running intervals, because what we want to do is we want to stress the entire lower body system through the means of running at a certain speed. And then because we don't want to run consecutively too long too soon, because that might lead to strain of tendons, tendonitis, etc., you want to give that break, especially to the heart, but especially to the lower body system. You don't want to overstress your joints, ligaments, and tendons too quickly. So usually I'll have these running intervals where 30 to 60-second run followed by a 1 minute walk. And you can repeat that for anywhere between 4 to 5 times on your first run, and it can slowly increase the amount of running intervals. So if you do 1 minute run, then 1 minute walk, and you do that 5 times, that's 5 minute run, 5 minute walk. That's a total of 10 minutes of walking, running. And then you can increase that duration by way of adding more intervals. So you add, let's say 5 to 6 intervals, then maybe you get up to at least 10 to 12 intervals. So 10 to 12 intervals is 10 minutes of running. And then it's also 10 to 12 minutes of walking as well. So that's a very safe way to return to running. And then what do you do from there once you hit, a sensitive point of maybe 10 to 12 minutes of run walk interval? Then you can start to increase the running interval. So that increase in the runner interval means that instead of 30 to 60-second run, you're going to go 60 to 90 seconds or 60 to 120 seconds, up to the point where then you're adding on 2 minutes of run, 3 minutes of run, 4 minutes of run. And usually the walking interval, that would stay the same. So eventually it'll be just 1 minute walk still. But eventually you might either completely wean off the walking. So then it's not intervals anymore. It's simply just running. Okay. So that's, again, a very safe way to do it. Again, there's Strava, there's Garmin. I like to use spreadsheets, and I also like to use just docs where basically let's say the columns would be the date that you run. That's one. It's the protocol that you run. So that'd be like 1 minute run, 1 minute walk times 4 to 5, right? Okay. I also want to log like some notes. So like notes are symptoms, like what you felt during the run, what you felt after. So that way you have a gauge of like how much you can tolerate. It's your subjective response. So like, oh, this was a 5 out of 10 strenuous activity. It wasn't a 10 out of 10. And my knee was mildly sore, but it wasn't too bad. And I want to see how I respond the next day. So these types of notes and logging of symptoms is also very important when it comes to returning to running. So I like to stay as objective as possible, especially when working with clients. So the objective points are all the numbers of the frequency, the time, how fast you run. All those numbers speak more volume to me than somebody that just runs and they're just like, I thought it was hard. That's a surefire way of potentially flaring yourself up and demotivating yourself from running. You want to have numbers and you want to log those numbers. Okay. But still you want like a journal, a reflection of like how the run felt during, neither before, after, or during. Okay. So hopefully I've hit the nose on, how you can return to running safely through spreadsheets and Google, logging through apps as well, but also understanding the principle of mechanical stress quantification. If you want more insight on what that kind of looks like, I know I'm explaining it through just verbiage. But if you want, I can also plug in a YouTube video. It's a pretty quick 3-minute video, and I'll link that in the description as well. Okay, so let's go into part 3. Part 3 is what I look for when I'm evaluating running form. So when I started my business back in 2019, I was strictly just doing more in-person things. So in person, I was either weight training, I was doing a mixture evaluating stuff, but also, again, I was a certified running pro. A few of my clients in San Francisco were indeed runners that were either injured, so I was helping them recover from injuries, or there was somebody that wanted to improve their overall fitness. So therefore, it was teaching them how to return to running after they haven't ran for months or years. Okay. But nonetheless, the principles are the same. When I'm working with people in person, I was looking at people on a treadmill at a gym that I rented out of. So I was filming people about 10 to 15 seconds from a side view. If I could get to the front view, I wanted to see the front view as well. But, sometimes treadmills are fixated to like a mirror or something in front of you. So at minimum, it was always a side view running for 10 to 15 seconds, and I would film it. And I would also do 10 to 15 seconds from a posterior view, so the back view, because those are the two most important views I want to see when it comes to looking at things like stride length and looking at hip symmetry and seeing, if the knees cave in, or seeing if the foot kind of crosses the midline, or seeing how much vertical translation there is in relation to horizontal translation. So those are a lot of variables that I look at. I don't want to get you confused with like all the little small things that I just talked to you about. So there's a principle I say that's called like rocks, pebbles, and sand. When it comes to running and returning to running, the rocks, which are larger boulders, those are the most important variables in order to teach somebody how to run optimally. Okay. Then you have your pebbles and you have your sand. The sand is like looking at really small angulations of like how the foot dorsiflexes and hits the floor. What is the exact angle at which the knee hits the floor? What is the exact angles of like all these different things? How much hip drop is there? Does the pelvis stay neutral, or does the pelvis drop to one side? What is the exact angles? Those are all pebbles and sand. So those are way too complex for this episode today. And those are small nuanced things that I would look at if I needed to. So even as somebody that's been training runners and returning runners safely for over 8 to 10 years now, I can definitely say that when I was a younger physical therapist, I was looking at all the nuanced angles and stuff. And I was really looking at the pebbles and sand, but I really wasn't solving for the rocks, which are the bigger boulders that will allow you to succeed when it comes to returning to running. Okay. So I want to talk strictly about the rocks, which are the most important variables. And it comes down to 3 things. Okay. And I'm going to share with you those 3 things now. So I'm now currently also training people online as well. So a lot of clients, they'll film themselves from a 10 to 15 second view, from a lateral view as well as a posterior view. So if you're interested in getting your running evaluated, or if you're looking to get onto any programs, I'll leave a link in the description. Go ahead and send in the application, and also book a free consultation with me. So that way we can see if I can build you a roadmap and see how it can help you specifically with your running endeavors. Okay. So here are the things. So the very first thing I would look at is something called cadence. Okay. That is the very first rock. The very first thing when I'm looking at running from either a side view or a posterior view is called cadence. Cadence, by definition, is how many beats per minute, right? So there's cadence in music, but there's also cadence when it comes to how many times the foot hits the floor per minute. Okay, so I would call it steps per minute. So the steps per minute is something that's very important. I'll explain why. So if you're somebody that, let's say maybe you're heavy set, or maybe you're not that strong. So your feet, each foot, especially when you're in that single leg stance phase, let's say your foot spends much more time on the ground, like per minute. What research shows is that the longer that you spend time on the ground, that increases your chances for injuring something in running. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because if, let's say, you're super fast, like Usain Bolt, your feet are barely on the floor for like, a millisecond, right? People that can get their feet off the floor faster are the ones that have better running economy. They're more efficient with running. They usually have a higher cadence, so more steps in a minute. And also they spend more time in the air. And that's a great thing, because then they're focused more on horizontal translation, and they're usually faster. Their mile time is decreased. However, if you think about, again, spending more time in that single leg stance phase, each foot, and I should have said this in the beginning, but each time your foot hits the floor, that increases your stress directly to that limb by 300 to 500%. That's amazing. So that increases your body weight, or the stress to that specific limb, by 300 to 500%. No wonder people get injured all the time, because whether their cadence is really slow, or whether they're spending a lot more time on the ground and we want them to get faster, but let's say their tendons aren't ready for it, that will increase the stress. And so basically you look at the amount of time. So the amount of time that you're on the floor increases the stress to that limb. Okay. But also the cadence as well. So if your cadence is slow, then you are spending more time on the ground as well. Okay. So the average American, or even the average person that runs, especially I think they say the average American, by research, runs at about 145 to about 155 steps in a minute. Okay. So 145 to 155 steps in a minute, that is how many steps that you get in. So basically, if your cadence is slow, that is how many steps you get in a minute. That basically means that you're spending a lot more time either on the ground, okay, or you're somebody that kind of like focuses a lot on like hopping up and down. So like, that up and down movement is preventing you from actually running forward. And so the more up and down movement that you have, and I'm sure you've seen runners that like, they really see them run up and down, almost like Baywatch, or let's say you see, like, especially with women, that you see their ponytail really goes up and down, up and down, up and down, rather than kind of like swinging side to side. Usually that increases, again, that mechanical stress to each individual limb by, maybe not the minimal, which is 300%, but it may increase the stress to that limb system by about 500%. And that increases the propensity for injury. So if you are somebody that is serious about returning to running, I always look for evaluating it. I would have somebody usually run and force the cadence right from the get-go. That is a rock that we want to solve right from the first session. So usually I'll have an app on my phone where I'm measuring the amount of steps that are getting in a minute, aka cadence. And if I see that they fall between 145, 155, and sometimes even 160, which I consider a little slow, what I'll force them to do is I'll have them run at a faster cadence. Now, you cannot just tell somebody to just run faster, okay? Especially if you're outdoors, you can't just say get in more steps in a minute, because usually they'll make the mistake of trying to get more steps in a minute, but then they'll actually run faster. So they're running 5 miles an hour and you're like, I want to get more steps in a minute. You'll tell them they'll move their feet faster, but in turn, they're no longer running at 5 miles per hour. They'll start to run at like 6 to 7 miles an hour. And that doesn't increase the cadence at all. That just increases the speed. And that's a no-no, because that's just going to promote more chances of injury, right? Increasing speed is increasing the mechanical stress of the system. So I love to train clients, and I love to only evaluate clients strictly on a treadmill, because if let's say they're getting in, they're running 5 miles per hour, but also they're only getting in 155 steps in a minute, I can keep them at the same speed by way of the treadmill. The treadmill clocks them only at 5 miles per hour, but I can actually run like an app called a metronome, where I can actually say, well, this is what 155 sounds like, right? And I'll play the beat, and the metronome will play the beat at 155. And I'll say, hey, now I want you to run at this specific cadence. And this specific cadence is 165. So usually they'll hear the beat like click, 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 right? And they'll be like, oh, so that's what it sounds like. I'll let them listen to it for a bit, and then I'll have them train to it, right? So while they're running, I'll tell them, use your arms and move your arms to the beat of this specific metronome, right? Which is, let's say you're increasing the cadence by 10. So I want you to run at 165, and maybe we'll adapt to like 175 to 185, because by research as well, is that the best endurance runners, their cadence is at least 175 to 190. And then definitely especially with sprinters, that cadence is much higher. Okay. So with regards to that, that is the very first rock that you want to fulfill, because like I said, just to kind of recap things, is a slow cadence will increase stress to each individual limb by 400 to 500%. You're going to spend a lot more time on the ground. You're going to also, you potentially might see these people that are more like kangaroos. They tend to like jump up and down rather than focusing on running forward. And it also leads to something called overstriding as well when you do have a slower cadence. And so that foot, basically that foot that lands on the floor, that foot is landing in front of their center of gravity. And so when that heel or that toe lands too far forward in front of the center of gravity, so like think about like your whole entire, like your head all the way down to your pelvis, that's your center of gravity, is that you increase a propensity for injury by way of overstriding. So a lot more stress on the knees, the hips, the lower back as well. Cadence, again, first thing to adapt to. If you're interested, again, there's plenty of free metronome apps as well. I sometimes will have my clients, like if they can't listen to a beat forever while they're training, is also looking at Spotify. Spotify has a lot of playlists where you can test your cadence, or you can, again, come to evaluate with me either online or in person. I can evaluate you and tell you exactly what to do. Spotify is really great. So I'll tell my clients, go to Spotify. If I tell them to run at a specific steps per minute, there you can actually type that into Spotify, 170 SPM or 170 BPM. And there's a lot of playlists in which you actually run and your feet land to the beat. And sometimes that's a little bit less insane than listening to just like a click, 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 click. It's instead, you're actually listening to at least music. So Bluetooth headphones, running on a treadmill. I always say that if you're returning to running, always do your best to like run on a treadmill, because that way you can monitor all the variables more controllably. If you are somebody that like can't stand running on a treadmill, that's fine. Just understand that when you're outdoors, there's variables like the type of pavement that you're on, there's different ground, and you know that the ground moves side to side. And not just that, it's a little bit harder to control your speed as well. So just take a lot of that into account when it comes to returning to running. Okay, let's also talk about the other rocks as well. The other rocks I want to talk about is sound, right? So sound basically means that when I have somebody on a treadmill, I'm actually listening to the right and left leg. So I'll usually lock my eyes onto a specific limb, and I'll also want to hear symmetry. So I like to hear symmetry in terms of the right versus the left limb. Now, which one sounds louder, right? Which one sounds softer? Because usually softer is associated with potentially that limb is either stronger, it's a little bit more resilient, maybe you have better tensile strength in your tendons. So it's a little bit more elastic and it can get off the floor like a spring faster on that limb, versus the other limb. Let's say the other limb, it's the injured limb, or that's the limb that has less overall capacity. That limb has less tensile strength. The Achilles isn't as spring loaded. So you might hear like more of like a clamp, like a kind of like sometimes it sounds louder than the other limb. So a lot of times to correct for that though, is if you do hear discrepancies in one limb versus the other, you can try to think about one kind of like telling them to actually soften up the landing on that side. And a lot of times they just become more acutely aware to land softer on that side. Another long-term strategy that we'll dive into a little bit further is definitely doing more strength training side. So more unilateral or like one single-sided type of leg workouts where you know that if the louder side potentially is the weaker or less capacity side, is that by way of strength training or maybe addressing certain mobility restrictions, is that you focus a lot of your attention on that louder limb that may be incurring more mechanical stress, right? And the other side is perfectly fine. But like I said, most people, people sometimes do get bilateral injuries, but especially when we're returning to running, you'll usually notice that one limb is stronger than the other, has greater capacity. So focusing on that louder limb makes sense. Okay. So that is another rock to hit on. The first rock being cadence, the second rock then being about the not necessarily foot strike. So a lot of people think that foot strike is most important, but foot strike can actually be corrected for by way of increasing cadence, or sometimes also monitoring the loudness of each limb when it hits the floor. Okay. So the third one that I always look at is actually seeing how they run in different types of shoe wear. And so not just shoe wear. So a lot of times if somebody comes into the clinic, they're not coming in with like two types of shoe wear, but how I can test for whether somebody runs at like more proficiently is actually having them run in the shoes that they brought into the clinic or the shoe that they're wearing, but also having them run barefoot. Okay. So I know that there's this huge viral trend that's still pretty trendy nowadays, but this has been going on for at least since the early 2000s, is this trend towards minimalistic wear, right? Running in shoes that basically mimic more of like the caveman days, right? Or just increasing the stress to like the foot and getting the foot stronger. So there's a lot of research about that, but it's not for everyone. I would say that definitely like 80-90% of my clients definitely benefit from shoes that are like less clunky and actually less supportive, even though a lot of podiatrists or a lot of running trainers will say, the very thing. And I think it's like a selling trap is telling somebody immediately that like you pronate or your foot flatten out. So therefore you're going to need a supportive shoe, which often become more expensive, or sometimes that they overpronate. You'll get them some sort of like heel cup or orthotics or something in order to correct for that pronation. In reality, I think that's the wrong way to go about it. And I don't think this is by way of like chance. Like I know for certain, I know for a fact, and based on like the hundreds of runners that I've worked with, is that these types of things around like telling people that they need orthotics because of overpronation, or getting people into super overtly supportive and really clunky shoes, that ruins a running economy. If you think about heavy shoes, guess how your cadence is going to be? Your cadence is going to slow down tremendously because you're having to lift this heavy shoe off the floor. And a lot of these motion control technology shoes, where it has like, it corrects for like, let's say overpronation, or let's say it has like a lot of ankle support, for example. Again, if you think about motion control technology, if you are depending on the shoe for stability or correcting for certain things, then you're not teaching your body intrinsically how to correct for it. So a lot of times I'll see that chronically people's foot muscles will atrophy. Their foot muscles will decrease in size and density a lot of times when they're in these motion control shoes, but then they decide to like wear sandals. They can't tolerate walking in sandals or walking in more minimalistic wear. So there's a lot of cons to being in motion control shoes. You might feel better initially because motion control shoes they're thicker, they're more bulky, so it makes your feet feel better initially. But what it will do in the long term is it will teach you improper running mechanics. It will slow down your cadence. It might make you heel strike or overstride harder. So it's going to increase the propensity to injure other areas. Even though maybe your Achilles, your foot feels better, you might notice that in clunkier shoes that your knees hurt more, your hips hurt more. This is exactly what happened to me running in shoes these shoes were really they're quite clunky. The heel was really thick, so like it protected the heel from like feeling the cement, and the shoe, as far as like how much it could bend, it was really the forefoot, which is only the toes, that was the only part it can bend. So but the midfoot and the hindfoot, it was super stiff. So I was already a pretty decent runner. And when I started running consistently, what I noticed is that I think I was overstriding. I even evaluated myself and I noticed I was overstriding a lot. But what I noticed that like my knees were getting extremely achy, even just sitting still, my knees would just ache for a long period of time, and I had to stand up in order to relieve it. So like I said, there's a lot of research to show that more supportive motion control, heavier shoes are not going to always be for you. Okay. So going back to that third rock of shoe wear is, even though maybe somebody has never ran barefoot, I want to see how their running mechanics change with wearing their shoes versus wearing without. And so if somebody is what I call a positive adapter, what I'll notice is a few things. I'll notice that their cadence improves, right? If there's not a bulky shoe to weigh that foot down, then their cadence should improve. That means that if they're 155, you should notice immediately that that cadence goes up at least 10 beats per minute, if not more, right? So that's a pretty cool thing to see. And maybe that means that they benefit from a shoe that's less supportive with a little bit more flexibility and that's lighter and also has less of a heel to toe drop as well, okay? But sometimes I'll see negative adapters, and there's not a lot of them, but somebody that, let's say they're running in shoes and I can see their foot strike, their cadence and all that. And then I'll have them wear no shoes and I'll have them do the same treadmill test at the same speed. And then I'll notice that either they get worse, like you can hear their feet just like clamp. They sounds like echoes hitting the floor. So their feet, they feels worse. Or let's say their cadence doesn't improve. So variables that don't improve, I might say, wow, that person doesn't necessarily benefit from a more minimalistic shoe wear. They need to focus actually more on like actually the nuanced things I told you about. The pebbles and the sand. So I might actually correct how they run. I might force them to increase their cadence. I might get them on a good strength and mobility plan as well. But right now, I'm not going to like switch out their shoes. But if somebody adapted and their cadence and the running economy improved, I would definitely switch them to a shoe immediately that was more minimalistic, right? And sometimes you don't have to start off with like the Vivos and the things that are like complete 100% minimalist. There are grades of minimalism. And so that is actually in my runner's ebook that you can download. There's actually 5 criteria that define the percentage of minimalism. And then also there are a couple shoe databases and things that you can get directly from my ebook. And so when you click on that database, you can actually pick the types of shoes in order to slowly adapt towards a more minimalistic wear, especially if you are a positive adapter. So again, go to flexdrdj.online/runners-ebook. Leave that in the description. And you can download that book for free, which is essentially a lot of the stuff that I'm referring to right now. Okay, so those are my 3 rocks when it comes to evaluating form. Like I said, I've done hundreds of evaluations in person. And then obviously there was the pandemic. The pandemic kind of forced people to kind of like be open to online work. And believe it or not, you know, especially if I'm just filming people, tons of clients from like the UK, all over the world, have benefited from getting an online running assessment from me and my team. And we're able to evaluate your foot strike, evaluate your, again, the loudness, the cadence, and all the different things. And we're also able to build you out a custom strength and mobility plan and even look at your nutrition as well. So we have pretty comprehensive plans, runners, whether you're a runner returning from injury or thinking about somebody that is returning to running, especially if you're motivated by this episode, in which I'm explaining the indications for why you might want to run. Okay, so the shoe wear part is something I still want to hit on a little bit more. There are a few criteria when it comes to shoe wear. I might not go through all of them, but I want you to be acutely aware of it. It's also very much detailed in my ebook as well. Some of the things you want to talk about is weight. So the weight of the shoe. Well, again, if one shoe is super heavy, like Hoka's, and it's weighing your foot down like an anvil, you better bet that you might start to overstride. It might make you a lot more cumbersome. It's going to hurt things up above the feet. So I can't stress enough that like I rarely give somebody super heavy shoes because it just absolutely ruins one of the big rocks, which is cadence. That's one, is weight. Another thing is heel to toe drop. So basically the distance. So when you measure vertically with like a ruler, the amount of height of the heel minus the height of the toe. So where the toe is. So that is called a heel to toe drop. So if it's completely flat and you're completely flat to the floor, the heel is very much even with the toes. That is what we call a 0 heel to toe drop. But for some people, That's not always the right thing to start off with, right? I actually can run very well in heel to toe drop shoes, but it took me a while to adapt to it. I was getting a couple Achilles issues and like my foot felt overly strained. But over time, over months and years, I've transitioned to shoes that are super flexible and have a straight zero to heel to toe drop. But if you're somebody that has tight Achilles cord, maybe you've had a Achilles injury, Achilles reconstruction, maybe you've torn your Achilles in the past, maybe you've had some sort of like excessive things to the foot, like stress fractures or metatarsalgia. Some people that maybe have hallux valgus, although that wouldn't be like a clear indication. But anything in which you've had like a lot of chronic foot issues, you may not start just right away with like a shoe that's 100% minimalist, zero heel to toe drop. You might start off with a heel to toe drop that's like 2 to 4 millimeters, and then transition potentially to a zero later on. Okay. Another one is like lateral, like motion control technology. So the amount of technology in the shoe is also is also one of the indicators of how minimalist it is. There's also how much the shoe folds. So one is called an A to P fold, where basically you take the shoe in one hand, the heel, and you take the other part of the shoe with the other hand, which is the toes. And you want to see if you could fold it into a sandwich. And so depending on how much it folds is also a product of minimalist versus shoes that are more supportive. And then also if you take the shoe again, like face the toe directly to the camera, and you kind of wring it out like a towel, which is more like the hot dog type of like mechanism. So like the length side, and you twist it, that's the amount of medial to lateral torsion or amount of flexibility. So you look at A to P as well as medial to lateral torsion of the shoe, and that will also be an indicator of how minimalist it is. Okay. So I hopefully that gives you an indication of like the minimalist. This thing is called the minimalist index. So based on these kind of factors will determine what percentage of minimalist it is. Okay. Like I said, if you are a positive adapter, and let's say we notice that your cadence improves and all that, then you may actually benefit from a shoe that's more minimalistic. All right. So let me take a deep breath here. And if you're finding this information super helpful, wherever you're listening to this, whether you're listening to the car, Spotify, Google, or you're listening to this on like Facebook, Instagram, I highly encourage you if you can. I am trying to really help a lot more people, so the algorithm kind of feeds into it. If you can, please either leave a like, subscribe, and follow. Please leave also a 5-star review when you can, and also leave some sort of description. So that way more people can get this type of information. More people will be able to view this information, especially if they're searching for certain keywords like running, injury prevention, pain. This is a lot of the stuff that I speak about on my podcast and many of my other episodes. So again, you would be really supporting me if you can like, subscribe, follow, but also leave a 5-star review. I would greatly, greatly appreciate that. Okay. So now let's talk about lastly, what are the proper strength and mobility principles to ensure minimal to no setbacks when it comes to return to running? So there's so much research to show that a proper strength training plan is critical, especially if you're returning to running or want to become a more optimal runner. A lot of my times I'll tell my clients that, let's say you love running, but you don't like weight training as much, or let's say you hate weight training. I always say that it's still a necessary evil. You should be weight training at least, write this down, at least 1 to 2 days per week, training legs in the gym or training legs at home in the form of some sort of dumbbells and bands. Now, here's why. Because even just somebody that is consistently doing something like, let's say, squats for 4 to 6 weeks, or even if you're doing calf raises for 4 to 6 weeks, research shows that if you are consistent doing that 1 to 2 days a week, that is going to decrease your chances of injuring by 200 to 400%. That will also decrease your mile time immediately through improving muscular hypertrophy and capacity. Okay, so that's really important. And also, if you think about it, when it comes to squats and calf raises, that is a weight bearing exercise. So running in itself is a weight bearing exercise, but when you are challenging your system, you may not challenging your cardiovascular system as much as running, but what you're doing is you're increasing the stress to the joints, the ligaments, the tendons. You're building the muscular capacity around your joints so your joints don't hurt with running. So that is why when I really started to weight train, that is when I really started to notice that my mile time decreased tremendously. I was not getting hurt as much. So somebody that is fully reliant on just either walking or running as their modes of exercise, and if they're sacrificing that 1 to 2 days a week of weight training that they should be doing, the likelihood is you will increase your propensity for injury. The likelihood is you may have to give up running sooner in life. So I don't want that to happen to you. And if you are returning to running, definitely start weight training right now. Okay. Weight training at least 1 to 2 days a week. Now, what are some of the muscles? And we'll break down some of the muscles that are really important. I would like to know, maybe even in the comments, like before I even the answer, I'm going to say the question. Go ahead and comment below what you feel is the most important muscle in the legs when it comes to running. I should have said legs because, maybe core was really important for running. But what do you feel is the most important muscle for running? And this is not arbitrary. I really think that this is factual. This is the most important, and the answer may surprise you. Okay, so let me know in the comments what you feel is the most important muscle for running. Okay, so if you said quadriceps, which is your front thigh muscle, not true. That is not the most important. It's important. All muscles are important to the legs, but not the most important. What about glutes? Okay, everybody, especially in nowadays society and in social media, glutes, the butt muscles. That's also not true. Now, what about hamstrings? Okay, hamstrings, part of the posterior chain. Is that the most important muscle? Nope, that's also not the most important as well. The most important muscle when it comes to running and to make sure that you decrease your risk for injuries and you can return to running safely or improve optimal running is your calves. Okay. Now your calves is broken down into two muscles. One is your gastrocnemius. That is a muscle that attaches from your Achilles cord and your heel all the way up into the back of your legs, and it almost meshes with your hamstrings. And then there's also a muscle called the soleus. The soleus also attaches to the Achilles and the calcaneus, but that one actually attaches directly into the tibia. So it doesn't have an attachment to the knee. And I'll tell you why that's important in terms of relation to how you strengthen these muscles individually. But the calves are the most important because it attaches directly to your foot. It also has interplay with your plantar fascia or the arch muscle. So basically the fascia underneath your foot, as well as the 4 layers of muscle underneath your foot, it has direct interplay with that because those muscles also attach to your heel just on the bottom of your foot. And so these muscles on the bottom of your foot, and as well as your Achilles and your calf, are what we call the windlass mechanism. Okay, WINDLASS. This mechanism is basically a push and pull and a balance of tension between the calf as well as the muscles in the foot. So if you are somebody that is serious about getting back into running, is that you do want to do a significant amount of calf raises. So I'm doing this in the video, like your tiptoes, or even weighted tiptoes or weighted calf raises. So when you build up the Achilles, okay, one, you're going to improve the tensile strength of the Achilles. The Achilles will become more elastic, so you can spend less time on the ground and more time going forward, which will increase your cadence as well. And also, you'll decrease the propensity for developing things like plantar fascia or also stress fractures to the foot as well, and many of the other foot-related injuries that can occur. So by way of calf strengthening, you will make the entire system stronger. And I always say this, running at the end of the day it's highly dependent on what happens to the foot, right? How the foot lands in relation to the rest of the body. So if you know that the most important things is what the foot does and how the foot lands in relation to space, how much time the foot stays on the floor, is that you really want to start off with the calf, the muscle that is the most powerful muscle that attaches to the ankle and foot complex. That's one. But also when the calves are weak, right, you do increase the propensity of injuries to the areas up above, namely your knee, your hip, as well as your lower back as well. Okay, so just take that into account that the calf is actually the most important. The beauty of saying that should be almost like a sigh of relief, right? Because you're like, Jay, how do you strengthen hamstrings? What's the best exercise for hamstrings? What's the best strengthening exercise for quads and glutes? There's so many exercise you can do to strengthen those, but the calves is actually overtly pretty simple. There's really only two ways to strengthen the calves, okay? Maybe three. But one is to strictly, again, just start doing tiptoes everywhere you go while brushing teeth. You know, kill two birds with one stone. Start doing more calf raises, right? Quantify that as well. So that's straight. So that's with the straight knee is where if you do it with a straight knee and then you do your tiptoes, you're strengthening and biasing the gastrocnemius. So that's your more explosive muscle that attaches to the Achilles. And then what you do is with the soleus, which is the muscle that only attaches to the tibia and it doesn't cross the knee, you actually bend your knee. So maintain a bent knee position. Very, very shallow. I'm actually in that position right now, only about 10 to 15, maybe 30 degrees of knee flexion. So you're staying in a mild squat and then maintain that degree of knee flexion. And now you're still going to do your calf raise. So these are called bent knee calf raises. And that's how you're going to bias the soleus. And the soleus is a more endurance-based muscle. And both of these two, bent knee as well as straight knee calf raises, should be overloaded. So whether you want to increase the volume in the form of repetitions, so, you know, think about how many times your foot hits the floor per run. It's literally hundreds to thousands, right? So you do want to tolerate at some point, hundreds of calf raises in a row, right? Or consecutively, or break it up into sets. And you also do want to build the size and the capacity of that muscle. So how do you build size and bias size when it comes to calf raises? Add dumbbells, right? So hold a dumbbell in one hand's against the wall, and overload those tissues. And also you can also do barbell calf raises, right? So you put a bar on your back, you can load it up, load some plates, and that's another mechanism of how to strengthen your calves. Okay. The third way, which is less necessary, is by way of bending your knee, right? So like doing like hamstring curls with your knees, because you do strengthen your gastroc, right? So even though you're bending your knees, basically bending your knee is going to bias the primary muscle, which is your hamstrings, but also you're secondarily also strengthening your calves as well. Okay. So other muscles to think about are hamstrings. Hamstrings is basically like the slingshot of the leg. So basically, if you want to get faster, you definitely want to do a lot of knee flexion curls, like prone hamstring curls, or maybe you're attaching a band to both legs and then you're bending your knee back and forth. So that's hamstring curls. You can also strengthen your hamstrings through hip extension because it attaches to basically your butt bone. So if you're doing a lot of hip extension, like deadlifts, lunges, Bulgarian squats, those are also other ways to strengthen your hamstrings as well. Okay. Also strengthen your quads. Quads are still important in order to absorb shock or in order to decelerate the knee and the tibia while you're running downhill. So quads are still really important. So quads is a knee extensor. So basically when you straighten your knee, you can feel that quad contraction. So the most important exercises with quads is either you're going to the gym doing leg extensions, but the common way that most people can get it in at home or at a gym is usually doing some sort of squat variation, a leg press variation. Even lunges are mostly quad dominant. So those are other ways to get in your quads. And also hamstrings and glutes. That kind of comprises your posterior chain. So make sure you're still getting your deadlifts. A great exercise I like to give to my clients is like Roman extensions at the gym. So like I said, this episode is not to give you a comprehensive, like, here's all the exercises available to strengthen quads, hamstrings, glutes, and calves. But now you kind of know what's the most important, what you should be thinking about. You understand the frequency as well, 1 to 2 days, bare minimum for any recreational runner, you should be strength training. Okay. All right. So that is what I got for you guys today. I really hope that this episode really gave you a really strong breakdown of what you can do, whether you're trying to optimize your running and you're already a runner, you're experienced, but you just want to get better, or whether you're somebody that wants to return to running after months and years of not doing it, or maybe you're coming back from an injury. You got injured during running, you've put it on hold because you're not sure what to do, and you want some guidance on how to return to running safely. Definitely, I feel like this is probably the best episode that I've done when it comes to running injury prevention and returning to running. So like I said, if you got any sort of value from today, definitely please support my channel by clicking the like, subscribing, or following, but also leaving a 5-star review. If you do that, anybody that types in the word running, Usually the algorithm kind of finds them and they'll send them this episode and they'll get a lot of value out of it as well. So please do me a favor in doing those things for me. I would greatly appreciate it, and it would support me in creating more valuable content like this. And like I said, my free gift to you for this episode is my runner's ebook. Okay, an ebook that I created after doing multiple running workshops in San Francisco Bay Area. So please download that ebook. It's absolutely free. FlexDrDrday.online/runners ebook. And lastly, if you're interested in potentially taking the next steps, if you got a lot of value, but you want, some sort of hand holding, you want a plan that is customized to you, maybe even just want a running analysis, whether online or in person, definitely hit me up. I'll leave a description. I'll leave a link in the description for you to apply and also to book a completely free consultation with me and my team. Okay. And I'll leave that in the description as well. So I'll see you guys on the next episode, and have a beautiful rest of your day. I'll speak to you on the next one.